Okay, so just to kind of organize and understand where we're at right now, we should be kind of finishing up with this Unit 6 stuff where we're mainly talking about, responsive design, building out adaptive layouts. We're talking about resource files. We've been really focused in that kind of area, more in resource files and less in the Java code side of things. But it's an important thing that kind of dovetails between those two. Today I'll be doing a little bit more Java than I've done in the past days because there are some changes that you sometimes need to get into the Java code to do as well. So that's part of where we'll be today. I'm going to kind of trying to figure things out from the calendar. So, the part where we're at should be around phase 17. When you're looking at the game library project, basically under phase 17, today what we're looking at is iteration 4 and 5, which is where I'm asking you to work with this master detail flow, right? So the main part of what I want to go over today is how to do that conversion. I'm going to do that with the movie list project and walk that through once, and then I'm going to have you do that both with your game list and with your user list. Does that make sense? It's a bit of a hoops to jump through. I expect that there's some bugs you're going to run into along the way. Okay, this is one of those things where because we have a lot of features already in, and it's not an unusual place to be, there's a lot of things that you kind of have to keep working, right? So you're going to have to retest those things and make sure those are still working, because this is very easy in the thing we're going to do today to break some major features in your app. Okay, so have a very big heads up about that, where you do want to make sure that you're testing it and checking all those things that work, especially things like sharing, because if you screw some things up in here, your share links, for instance, won't work anymore. Okay, so just keep that in mind, right? There's a few things that we have to watch out for. In calendar-wise, also remember that we're going to be starting that last test this week. I've had some kind of move around and trying to get that ready. I have almost completed. I think I'm on the very last student in terms of grading that previous test, so I'll have that out. Just a heads up, this last test will be building on the test before. So there will be some points and some rubric in there where I'm going to ask you to go fix bugs in that previous test. So just a big heads up there. I'm going to have to ask that and also give you some opportunities to earn back points from that previous test for things you may have lost points because you can fix them. Okay? So it'll be an extension of that with the opportunity to replace some of your points that you may have lost on that previous test. Cool? But it will be in that receipt project. Okay. So that's that. There'll be a written test I need to make up. And then the very last thing we'll talk about next week is going to be styles and theming. Okay, that's going to be how we kind of round it up, is trying to make our apps look a little bit better. Okay. As usual, I try to have presentations on that last day. So we're going to try and have some final presentations with PowerPoints and all that, where I want you to show off your project on that last day. We'll talk about that next week. Okay, so that's kind of where we stand with the calendar and where we're working through today. So kind of a quick overview. I've got this on the whiteboard. I posted a copy of it in Discord. To kind of overview the things that we've talked about so far in Unit 6. Along the way, we talked a lot about resource qualifiers, and that's anytime you create a resource in Android, it can have a qualifier that it only applies to these kinds of devices or these types of situations. So we put qualifiers in there for language, for culture, for screen density. We just did that last week with the images, with the bitmaps. We said this is available for this density or that density. We've also looked at screen width. There's another one we'll talk about next week, is related to dark mode and light mode qualifier in there, the factors as well. It's worth mentioning that any resource that you have could have any of those qualifiers, any combination of those, right? And so Android is going to pick whichever version or combination of those resources is most appropriate for the particular configuration of the device. Okay, so that's important there. We talked about translation, we talked about localization, we talked about number formats and date formats as that fits in there. We've talked about using the dimensions resources and the integer resources to scale things based on different screen widths, right? So that's a common thing that fits in here as well. Integers specifically for changing the number of columns that appear in a recycler view. We looked at bitmaps and screen density and supplying different versions of that so that you don't have images that are blurry or grainy or aliased depending on what the density of your screen is. We looked at alternate layouts, so I had you make a layout for my profile that was different based on the width of the screen, right? More vertical or more horizontal. But today, there's two kind of topics I wanted to talk about. The main one is number 7, but number 6 is one that's kind of been, I've been trying to find a place to put it, and so we need to just cover it, so I'm going to talk about that today. And that comes down to really this article that's linked first in here, is that handling configuration changes. This is a really, really good place to look and know about what we're going to talk about here. Okay, so there's a thing to understand with all of these resources is that because the configuration of the device can change, that can change what resources it needs to load, whether that be different dimensions, different strings, different images, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on, right? So there's a whole bunch of things that need to change if the configuration of the device changes. Makes sense? So a lot of times that can happen in different ways. That can happen, configuration changes can happen if the user changes their language. That will cause a configuration change. If there is, you switch from dark mode to light mode, or you turn the screen sideways, right? Which the easiest one and the most common one that our users run into is they just turn the screen sideways, right? They change the orientation of the device, and now the configuration of the device is completely different, right? Which means that Android has to go, okay, all of those resources that I've previously loaded might be wrong now. All of the resources that I previously have loaded might be wrong. So I need to throw them all away and start over, right? I need to throw them all away and start over. So out of the box, the way that Android handles that, anytime you have a configuration change like that, it destroys the activity and creates a new one. Okay? It destroys the activity and creates a new one, which is a pretty big deal. Okay? It's destroying your activity. We got kind of, on create where we put a lot of things. There's also an on destroy, so you can do some stuff in response to that destruction event. Unfortunately, on destroy does not give you really a way to preserve yourself into the new activity. Does that make sense? Part of the important thing there is that the new activity that gets created is a brand new instance, right? It's a brand new object, completely fresh, with really no knowledge of the activity that came before, right? So that means any data that you're storing in the activity is lost when you turn the screen sideways. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. You lose all of your data if you turn it sideways. It's a pretty big deal to users, right? The other thing that means is, unfortunately, because you're destroying the entire activity and having to recreate it, it's actually also pretty costly. It's not unusual for there to be lag when the user, if you rotate your screen between landscape and portrait. Oftentimes the animations are not smooth at all if you've ever tried to do that. Okay, and even on the emulators you might see that there's a little bit of bumpiness. Like it tries to animate it, but there's so much going on that it usually stutters. Okay, so that's kind of an important thing to understand with the world of Android is you have that's the normal behavior. Okay, the normal behavior is that things get completely destroyed and recreated. Now, there is an option in Android where you can choose when the users say, hey, rotates the screen, if the configuration changes, you do have the option of saying, don't destroy the activity, I will manage all the changes myself. That actually is a possibility. You can do that. Android does provide a way to do that. Unfortunately, that's very rarely feasible because of all the things that have to change, right? Because of all the resources that have to change, it's usually not feasible to go that route, especially because a lot of times if you're rotating the screen, you do need the layout to change, and that's not something that's easily done. Does that make sense? So if you've got it all a case where the layout needs to change from horizontal from portrait to landscape, then you have to go ahead and let the activity be created and destroyed, or destroyed and recreated. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so that means that has a lot of implications for us in terms of how we need to write our code and how we need to work with things. Remember, part of what I want to do is I've got kind of 2 goals through that configuration change, or 3. Some of my goals in terms of handling that is I want to make sure that the user's data is preserved. I want to make sure all the correct resources are loaded when we get to the new configuration, that we're not using resources from the previous orientation or previous device configuration, and that it doesn't take an exorbitant amount of time. Does that make sense? Those are all 3 kind of stipulations that we want around that configuration change, especially around screen rotation. Okay? So, talking about the data being preserved. Okay, one of the good things with newer Android development is we've got these things called view models. Okay, we've got these things called view models, and we moved a lot of our code out of the activity and into the view model. Everybody with me there? We moved a lot of our code out of the activity and into the view model. One of the nice things about view models is that they survive all configuration changes. If I turn the screen sideways, everything in the view model is preserved. That view model just gets attached to the new activity. So when we ask for the view model provider, it will go ahead and look, oh, there's already, and look and find, oh, there's already a view model that we've created. I'm just going to reuse that, right? So through configuration changes, any data that I key, any data that I have in the view model is just automatically preserved, which is awesome, right? It saves us a lot of time, especially for things that we need to fetch from the database or the network. It means that we don't have to necessarily fetch those things again because they're in the view model, right? That makes a really big difference in terms of just the speed that it takes to handle that configuration change. Okay? Because all of that data is still there. Now, in terms of making sure the right resources are maintained, one of the gotchas then is understand that the only places where we can use and access anything that's resource dependent is in the activity and not in the view model, right? Because the view model is not going to be replaced, but the activity will. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. The activity will be replaced, but the view model won't. So as long as you're doing all your resource accessing on that side, then you're okay. And so that's part of why one of the reasons why we needed to move to having those error messages or any messages that we're showing from the view model be as the ID, an integer, instead of being as a string, right? So that's one of the bugs that we had to fix to make that work, okay? So, you know, a lot of times that's kind of the 2 pieces of it. Is we need to move all of our data as much as we can. We move it and we store it in the view model. We avoid storing things in the activity itself. And then we make sure that those, you know, any resource accesses, generally we're using IDs instead of the actual resource, probably get string in the view model. Okay? That'll actually handle most of the cases. Okay? Now, let me maybe run my app, and let's look at some of the things that are occurring though instead. So if I look at this, let me go to, I'm in the right project, I'm in the movie list. I want to run it on the phone. And this is one of those things you may, because you're starting to make because last week I had you make different variations of your layout, you may have seen some of this behavior. You might have started to see that there's some differences that happen when you rotate it, where you maybe lose some data. So hopefully you've seen a little bit of that. in the process that you've been working with. So some of the things that happen, let's say, oh, I do need to actually log in as a user to show one of the things that I want to show. Well, again, sign in with email. Get in here. Okay, so things I can do here, I can pick a genre, I can go like this, I can pick selections from my drop down here, and I can also have a scroll position, right? I can scroll to a different point. Maybe let me go to my votes. Oh, do I not have? Oh, because it's only filtered down to, okay. So I'll have to do it two ways. So one of the things I can do is I can pick things from the spinner, right? If I don't do anything, right? If I don't write any code, when I turn that sideways, what's selected in those spinners will be lost. Okay? Whatever you put as far as selection in the spinner, that's lost. It's also lost, remember, anytime I call set adapter on those spinners, disregarding the whole orientation change. Okay, so if I turn it sideways, if I didn't have any code in there, those two things would be lost. Those selections would not be preserved. Now, it's interesting to note that they are, right? My romance and my upvotes, both of those have been preserved through the orientation. Does that make sense? You see that? Okay, so why did that happen? Okay, let's look a little bit into our code for this. Would be UI, would be home, no, it'd be a movie list fragment. Okay, so let's look at what code we have around both of those spinners. Okay, so we start out, remember that one of these spinners is hard-coded as having a certain number of options, and another is based on a database query. Okay, but both of them effectively are dynamically populated. Okay, they're both populated from the code and not populated from XML resources. Okay, so that means that they are going to be changed after the activity gets recreated, right? Which that timing does matter. Okay, so when I go in here, you'll notice I've got a call to set this list adapter. Okay, so I'm setting the list adapter here, which in general usually would set the selected item back to 0. Okay, when I do that. Okay, I also have in here, I'm pulling in the genres, and then I'm updating the genres adapter, right, with that new list of genres. Okay. Again, this would normally result in the selected genre being cleared out and set back to 0, right? So we'd go back to all, right? So one of the things to notice in here, remember we previously had code actually to handle that, as it turns out. So if we look at what, like up on line 108, I'm actually tracking, what is the selected position. I'm actually going to get a little bit of data from the model. Remember, the model's preserved through screen orientation. So as long as the model remembers which genre I've picked, I can restore it after the screen has been rotated. Does that make sense? So the reason that this is working for the genre field is that I'm doing this code already that's preserving the ID by storing it in the view model. Okay. On that note, that makes me wonder what's happening with the list spinner, right? Why is that one being preserved? Because as far as I know, I am copying that data over into the view model, but I'm not really restoring it anywhere, right? You maybe see that. There's nowhere where I say list spinner dot, set the selected item, like down here, I'm calling set selection. I'm not calling set selection on the list spinner anymore. Does everybody see that? So normally my expectation there would be that it just gets set back to 0 when I rotate the screen. But we obviously saw that that didn't happen. Is everybody on board there? So something's got to be happening to preserve it. Okay? There's something got to be happening in terms of remembering what item I've selected and preserving it when we come back. Okay? Now, that's in existence. One of the things we can check, I do believe, and we're in a fragment, so I'll have to see if this works. Yes. Okay. So there's a method both in fragments and in activity called onSaveInstantState. Okay. This method's actually really important in terms of configuration changes. So what happens is anytime the configuration changes, this gets called first to save any data that you have in the views, right, or in the activity or the fragment, data that's actually on screen or part of your state. You can save it, and then that data that you save will then be available when you create the new activity or the new fragment. Does that make sense? So this is part of that restoration process. Now, the superclass as it stands is helping us out. It's trying to save some of the data that's on screen, at least the data that it knows about. And basically the way that it does is it kind of goes through all the views that are on screen and does what it can to try and preserve what the user's data is. Now, it doesn't preserve everything, so it won't preserve things like colors, anything you're changing in terms of colors or images. Those are all things that you have to manually preserve. But notice if I just comment out the superclass's behavior and go try to run this again, I'm going to see something a little bit different. So going back to here, my upvotes, romance, turn it sideways. Now I'm actually surprised by, because it's probably the activity that's still preserving it. Okay. So it might be the activity and not the fragment. Let me go up to home activity. So underneath on create, on save instant state, and I'm going to comment that out. And I'm just doing this as a way of testing and verifying, what is happening. There we go. Okay. So notice how once I pulled that out of the activity, that it didn't preserve the second spinner selection, right? If I pick anything from there, my votes, turn it sideways, it's not preserved. In fact, it looked kind of like the thing I'd said before, that both of those things are being lost. Okay. So part of the picture that you have to understand is that there's already some code built in that's trying to help you. Okay. There's already some code built in that's trying to help you. And so you can work with that code to make it better. You can work against that code and actually sometimes create more bugs when something was previously working. Right? So that's a thing to notice. One of the things we need to do oftentimes is override this method on SaveInstantState, but notice that if we don't call the superclass, then it may not preserve some things that it was previously preserved. Is everybody on board with that? Make sense? Okay. So that's a big thing to be aware of, is that it's already doing some things for you. Okay. So from that, there's basically only two things that I'm aware of that the system saves by default. Okay. So some things that it saves by default is for spinners, it will save the selected position, as we saw. And so it's just saving that as a number. And for edit texts, it will save the text. That's it. Out of the box, those are the only things it preserves. Everything else you have to work with. Everything else you have to manually preserve. In fact, even though these things are provided out of the box, Android's been kind of fickle about changing things without telling developers. I am very wary about relying on that default behavior. And so even if some of those things are saved by default, I generally would recommend manually going ahead and saving them yourself. Does that make sense to everybody? Because those are things that might work on whatever version of Android you're testing, but there's no guarantee that that will actually work on every device on the market. Do you follow with me? Right? Because these are things that are built in, at least seems to happen, but actually Android doesn't provide a guarantee that it's going to do that. Okay? They don't guarantee that that is the normal behavior. Okay? So typically things we need to do is save whatever data we care about, right? Whatever data that's in there that we need to preserve, we preserve that. Okay. Another place where this comes in, not just in fields, is if I had anything in here, which I've intentionally eliminated a lot of these things. If I have any place in here where I'm storing data of some sort, that data is going to be lost. So if I have instance variables that are storing maybe an auth token, user's ID, an ID of a receipt, some sort of subtotal, anything that I have as far as fields up here, assume that all of those things are going to be lost. Right? Every instance field in your activity, every instance field in your fragment, all of that data is going to be lost. So data we need to save is both data that's in instance variables up here, as well as any state data of the views that we care about. Does that make sense? Now, the important part is that we care about, because we don't want to save everything. There is a hard limit to how much you can save, because this oftentimes gets saved to a file, and there are some limits to how big that file can be. Okay? So one of the common things that people forget, some of the common things that people forget are visibility. Oftentimes you have to manually, make sure that things are invisible or visible as they should be when you restore. Error messages are also a big gotcha. A lot of times I'll see code in apps where you turn the screen sideways and error message is lost, right? It's not there anymore, right? Or other things such as, hey, the calculations are now different, etc. Maybe the value that was in an edit text previously is lost, spinner selection is gone, etc., etc., etc. Right? So what we want to pay attention to is really the state that matters to us. Okay? Now, where we can save that in the view model, I would much prefer to save that in the view model. It makes your life a lot easier if you can get that data into the view model. The reason being, first of all the data in the view model is preserved, so you don't have to worry about it. If you can just get it into the view model, then it's easy. The other thing about that is that because of the live data, the way it's set up, when you get to the new one, it will just fire off your observers. And so your observers run when the new activity is created. Does that make sense? So as long as all that data is in there, okay, all your observers can just restore that state. It does mean that you need to be very careful in your observers to make sure that they are predictable, right? That they always produce the same result and are not dependent on the order that they run or what the state of the UI was previously. Does that make sense? So that means if you're setting visibility in an observer, it always needs to set a visibility in the observer. Does that make sense? There needs to be no pathway in that code, in that observer, where it doesn't set the visibility of that field. Same with text. If it ever sets text anywhere in that observer, it always needs to set text in that observer, right? If it sets color, it always needs to set color, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Also, in terms of order, right, because you can't guarantee what order your observers will execute in, you don't want to have two observers that are updating the same view, right? So if I have observer 1, let's say observer 1 is updating the error message, and then I have another observer that runs after that that also updates the error message or the error text. Depending on which one runs last is the error that you're going to see. That's a problem. That's something we don't want to have. Okay? So it's very important that your observers are only affecting their views and not any other observer's views. Make sense? One of the things I've seen is sometimes people will go, oh, based on, whether or not this object, this document is null or non-null, we'll update an error message. You really, really do not want to do that. Or I've seen cases where people say, hey, based on the list of items is null, I'll show an error message. Again, you don't want to do that. If you're going to do that, you need to make sure it's a separate text view. Is everybody following with me? Those are important, and those are going to cause problems when you're doing a configuration change. Everybody on board? Okay, so let's talk about what I can do in terms of storing data. Okay, so what I've done already is notice both in the home activity, I've gone and overrode on save instance state. This is under on create. It's kind of the place I want this to be. So I've overridden it and I've commented this out so we're not getting into the default behavior that's built in. Now, I may want to come back later and turn that back on. But for the moment, I've turned it off. Same idea over on the movie list fragment. I've disabled the on-save instance logic by overriding it and then commenting out the superclass's behavior. Make sense? So previously the superclass had the chance to do its stuff, now it can't do its stuff. Okay? So let's look at what we can do to save our own data. So in terms of parameters that we get to on-save instance state, it's actually, you get this bundle. Now this bundle is what's going to be preserved. This bundle is the package that gets saved and passed on to the next version of the activity. Okay? So anything I put into this bundle, I'm going to be able to pull out later. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so it's a bundle. It kind of works like extras. So there's a bunch of put methods. So I can, for instance, say put into int, and so let's say, hey, this is the maybe the genre selected index, and I could go like genre spinner dot yes.
I notice we're in the fragment right now, and earlier you showed that this runs in potentially both the fragment and the activities, the activity and home activity. Which one do we target?
So
which one do we?
Right now I want to work in the fragment. Right now I'm intentionally working with the fragment.
Okay.
The answer is both, but right now I'm working in the fragment. Okay. What goes into those two sides is going to be different. Okay. So I want to save maybe the selected index for that and also for the list. right? So I'd maybe take what's the selected position. I'm going to save that to a variable. Now I don't have to do anything more fancy than that because this always returns an integer. It's worth mentioning that sometimes a string may not have anything selected, in which case this is going to return -1. But it's still an integer, so we're still staying. Cool. You do have to watch out for nulls. So that's kind of what I would set up here, right? If I needed any additional data, then I would need to save that data. But I've been very diligent about, if I look up at the top of the file, I don't have any additional data that I need to preserve, right? If I look at these views, that's all fine. I'll just find them again in the new layout. These variables under state, okay, we'll get the view model when we come back. We'll create a new adapter when we come back. We'll create a new genres adapter, list adapter. Those adapters will be recreated. I don't need to worry about preserving. Does that make sense? But if I had anything else, if I had any strings, integers, doubles, anything else that's in there, those things I would also need to preserve, right? So I'm going to start with just that. Now it's worth mentioning real quick. I would strongly recommend doing a log.i here from a debugging perspective, so that we can see if this is being run. So on save instance state, and so that way I know when this is being invoked. Okay. Because there's a high likelihood that it's not being called when you expect it to. It may be called at a different time. And so there's a high likelihood that it may not be called like you expect it to be called. Okay. So I'm going to pop up my logcat. I'm going to be filtering down to info and filtering by this particular place. So movie list, because that's my tag. Go ahead and clear out what I have here and run the app. So if everything's functioning as I expect it to, I should see it say on save instance state when I rotate it. Okay. Which, if I look at the log now, okay, looks like I actually did not. Okay. Notice that I did not see that log message. Okay. So that means that this function didn't get executed. Okay? It didn't get executed. Remember, we're in a fragment. Okay? So when I turn something sideways, out of the box, that actually requires a little bit of extra code to get down to fragments, because what actually happens is it calls the version on the activity, and then the version on the activity is supposed to preserve the fragments. Does that follow with everybody? Mm-hmm. Okay. So because the activity is not doing anything, it also in turn didn't call the fragment and didn't tell it what to do. So I need to go back to here. I'm going to put a log message on home activity and bring the parent back in. And so we'll also have that over here, right? So I'll have two logs for these different classes. And so now I should see something. All right, so turn it sideways. There we go. Now I need to take out my filter here, right? So what you can see is the first one that called was home activity on save instance state, and then it was movie list on save instance state. So everybody see that? So the activity got told first, and then the fragment. Right? The activity got told first, and then the fragment. But the fragment only got told because the superclass automatically goes through and tries to preserve all the fragments that are on screen. What were you gonna say?
It only got called because we allowed it to be called in the activity.
Right. Yeah. So if that was missing in the activity, then all of our fragment code doesn't even get one.
So
Okay.
we've kind of overridden it, but the only overriding we've done is just adding another line. That's the
Just
log.
adding another line to log that
So
it got called.
we could have just omitted this whole.
Right, and there would have been no difference.
Okay.
Right, now, it turns out for part of what we're trying to do today, we will probably need to override that in the activity side, okay? We will very likely need to override that in the activity side. So I do want to pay attention to that, okay? So that's good, okay? We're preserving the selected two items from the spinner. Where I want to, that out itself though doesn't do much of anything. Okay, this is just saving the data. It's just saving the data into this bundle. In order for that to do anything, you also have to restore it on the other side, right? So this saves it in one activity, one fragment. I have to then restore it in a new fragment, okay? So new fragment's not going to have any of my same instance variables. It's not going to have these spinners. I'm going to pull that in over on the other side. Well, if I go all the way up here, notice under line 55, on view created, look at what the signature of that function is. It takes a view and a bundle called saved instance state. Well, guess what? Saved instance state is the thing that I just saved in on saved instance state. So on save instance state gets called when it goes away, and then on create gets called when it comes back, when the new thing comes in. So that data that we just preserved is available in saved instance state. Okay? There's one gotcha. Notice that this is marked as nullable. The bundle may be null. In fact, the first time that this activity or this fragment comes on screen, it will be null. So it will be null initially, and then when we're restoring, it won't be null. So that's in fact the way that we know that it's being restored. The way that we know it's being restored is by that bundle not being null. Make sense to everybody? That's what tells us what's going on. Okay. So I'm going to look based on that and change my logic a little bit. Okay. So I'm going to go down around here, line 96. You notice where I'm setting the adapter. I'm setting the adapter on the list spinner. I want to restore the selected position from that saved instance state. So after this, I'm going to say if saved instance state is not null, if we do have data that we've preserved, then and only then, and I'm going to try and restore it. Okay. So from the saved instance state, just like I can do put to put data in there, I'm going to use get to pull data out. So I'm going to say get int. I need to remember what the key is that I used to put it in there in the first place. So what I used to put it in there in the first place was this list selected index. So I grab that and use that to restore it. And so up here it'd be int list selected index, right? So I'm going to pull that out of the bundle and use that to update the spinner. So list spinner dot set selection, and that would go to this. Okay, so if we try that now, and everything's working right, I think at least the one for the list should be preserved. So my outvotes, turn it sideways. Cool. Right, so it's still functioning. where it is functioning. So this is what you're oftentimes going to see. Is you're going to say, hey, is there a bundle? If there's a bundle, then I need to do some additional work. Cool? Okay. Now, what about the genre? Right? Because I did still save the genre, and I'd like that to be preserved when I turn it sideways. Okay. But notice I haven't done the same thing with that one. Right? Notice I haven't done the same thing with that one. It seems to be working, but obviously it's working a different way. Does everybody see that? So one of the things to understand, let's say in here, I want to restore the other list. So let's say, hey, I'm going to get the genre, selected index. So I'll get both of those, and genre spinner. And so what happens if I just try to preserve and restore both of those in the same way? And maybe I should have untangled these and maybe done them in a different order, but I'll leave that here a second. All right. So action, my votes, turn it sideways. I'm kind of surprised that that didn't fail. Because there's a little bit of a risk because of the timing of this. When I'm setting the selection and setting the selection on the genres, I haven't restored the items yet. The items list is still empty in the spinner. Right? I'm still not set in that one. So they're following with me?
Yeah, you're right. We're observing afterwards.
Because the observer happens down here, right? So I'm actually pretty surprised that that didn't crash. Let me try one thing as an experiment here. Let me say 10 instead of the value that we preserved. Oh, okay. It didn't crash. So I'm just wrong on that front.
What was it that you were trying to do and what were you expecting?
I was expecting that if I set the selection to an invalid number, which would be, there's not 10 things in that list, that it would have crashed. It would throw an exception at that point. And I guess it didn't. I guess the spinner just said, oh, okay, I'll remember this for you. So that works. We don't have to do anything additional. So that would be kind of the preservation side there. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody? Pretty simple. Not a huge thing we have to do in terms of usually preserving data. Now, another thing to pay attention to on this screen is to notice that the user can also scroll through the list, right? So I can scroll down to the bottom of the list, and if I turn it, maybe turn it the right way, okay? What is going on now?
I think you're upside down now.
Maybe. There it goes finally. Okay. So remember I was scrolling down to the bottom. What's my scroll position now?
Close, but not really.
Close, but not really. So depending on how you have your code set up, when you do a rotation and anything involves a list, one of two things is going to happen. It's going to scroll you all the way to the top of that list, or it's going to try and put you on your pixel offset, right? In this case, it's remembered I was so many pixels from the top and put me that same number of pixels from the top. Right, so that's one thing that may be lost from the user's perspective is where they are in a relatively long list. Okay, That's beyond the scope of what I want to talk about here because that can quickly get very complicated, but it's something to keep in mind that your users do see, and in some cases it's may be code we need to add additional code for. There's not a standard fix for that because oftentimes it involves figuring out what's the thing that the user has on screen and then trying to keep that same thing on screen when they come back. So for instance, if you're reading a blog, you probably look at, okay, what's the paragraph that's on the top of their screen? Let's make sure that that's on the top of the screen after the orientation still. Or, here I could maybe say, hey, what's the top item on their list and preserve that one, or I could do the same thing with the bottom, right? Whichever way makes more sense. So that's kind of what that would look like. Okay, now let me jump over to another screen. Okay, so I'm going to jump over to the detail screen. Okay, is there any things that the user can change, user data that we might need to preserve on the screen?
The images and their resolution?
Not necessarily, because the problem with the images and resolution, I might need to load a different resolution after I rotate. Okay. You're saying what? The reviews. Okay. The reviews should probably stick around, as long as I've put them in the view model that's already taken care of for me, right? They should already be there. Okay. I've still got the question about, hey, I can scroll this screen. This time I'm scrolling it with a scroll view instead of a recycler view. So we might see a little bit of difference there. So if I go to turn it, we do see that we do. Part of that is I don't think scroll views are preserved. I don't think that they factor into on-save instance state the same way as recycler views do. The other problem is because I'm reloading the images, the height of the screen actually changes during that load-in process, right? So because the images are kind of collapsed, we're basically having an activity that goes like this and then quickly expands, right? So even if it was trying to preserve the place where you're in the scroll, it would look at that, try to apply it, and say, oh, this is probably off screen. So it's going to move you back up further, and then the images get loaded in. So there's also timing issues that you have to worry about there as well. Cool? Does that make sense for everybody? Okay. Now, part of why things are behaving the way they are as well in this side of things is because I'm actually telling it to go get the data again. My code as it stands right now is every time I rotate the screen, it goes and fetches the data from the database again, contrary to what I want it to do. Now, why do I say that? If I go over to the activity, movie details activity, and I take a look in here, remember that in the activity is kind of the same thing here, where it received a saved instance state, which is null initially and then is not null the next time. When I go in here, where is it? I think it's towards the bottom, because that's where we make it. Right. So at the bottom of onCreate, based on the intent that the user picked, I'm calling fetch movie with that ID. Okay? Based on the intent the user picked. Okay. So one of the things to notice here, when I do a configuration change, again, the activity is created and destroyed, but anything that's in the intent is preserved, right? Your intents are preserved through the screen orientation, through the changes in configuration. So that's one place where data is also, we don't necessarily have to keep it, right? So why do I mention that? Because I've got state variables in here. I've got a movie ID, I've got a movie, I've got model. All of this stuff, remember, is going to go to null in the new activity, right? So I may need to preserve some of those things. Good news is if I don't do anything, movie ID is preserved because it's part of that intent. Okay. Now, I probably do want to go ahead and manually preserve it, but it is being preserved, okay, because it's part of the intent. Okay. So those things are being reworked, and so when I come back in the new activity, the reason this is reloading the data is because I'm calling fetch movie. If I wasn't calling fetch movie, then I would just be using the data that was already loaded. Does that make sense? So I actually need to do a little bit of a tweak to this code because I really need to say if saved instance state is null, then wrap that whole bit of logic. Right? If saved instance state is null, then I need to go do that stuff initially, but it actually turns out I don't need to do that stuff the second time. Now I might want to do some additional things, right? Because I'm not reading the intent, and which means I'm going to end up with a movie ID of null. But this code I only want to run the first time. Everybody following with me? So this is going to run the first time. It's not going to run after I rotate it. So things to watch out for. Let me put an else in here, and I'm going to just log some things. Else log .I log tag, and just to show that one of the things that happens, movie ID, I'm going to log that, just so we can see when it comes back that it's null.
It comes back as null because we haven't manually saved it, right?
Because we haven't manually saved it. So if I turn this sideways and look at logcat, this is movie details. There it is. See? So on save instance, or sorry, when we came back in here, we did get a movie ID of null, right? But you might see that there's a lot less flicker, a lot less going on when it rotates because I'm not calling fetch movie, right? Because fetch movie triggers all of that live data to update again, and now our observers get triggered again. And that's why you saw all those things change. But now when I rotate, those images are just kind of there, right? It's a lot smoother, right? Because I'm doing less code. Okay? All right. So how do I preserve these other things in that case, right? So that means when I'm dealing with this, I do need to override on save instance state, and I do want to say in here out state dots put string, and let's save the movie ID. Because that's part of our state. So I'm going to save that out, okay? And maybe I also might want to potentially save the movie itself, because remember we have a reference to that movie. Now, if you look through here, right, obviously I'm not going to have a put movie method. Does that make sense to everybody? I'm not going to have a put movie method. There's not even a put object method in here. All of these are for different types, right? So the closest equivalent that we have is something called put parsable, right? And so I could do something like this. And try to save the movie. The gotcha is, in order for this to work, movie has to implement or be a subclass of parsable. It has to be parsable in order for us to save it as part of this bundle. Okay, is everybody tracking with me there? So sometimes when I've got complex data, I may need to do that. The downside with that is A, first of all, it's actually a lot of additional code that you have to add to the movie class to make it work. The second side is actually kind of slow. Whereas that if we think about it a little bit harder, that actually being saved in the view model. So I really don't need to save the movie because the view model is already saving it. Does that make sense to everybody? I don't really need to save the view model, the movie object, because it's already being saved
In the view model.
in the view model. So rather than going through all of that work, it might make more sense for me to just save the movie ID and do something different for the movie object itself. Okay. Part of the reason that I care about this is if I go after I've rotated and I hit share, it might crash because some of those things are null. Now it looks like it did work in that case, but that's
model.observe.
Huh?
Is that because of the observer?
I think that's because the observer is still filling in the ID of the movie and the movie, and we were slow enough to click on share that it had already done that thing. I think actually that's probably a case of share is probably using the movie object and not the movie ID variable. So all that down to say, what I may want to do here is just save the movie ID. When I come back over here, I'm going to say movie ID is equal to saved state instance, get string, restore the movie ID that we had before, and then in terms of the movie, I might say take the model, get movie, get value, and just restore it that way, because that's going to be a lot quicker. But it still turns out that I don't actually necessarily need to do this per se, but I can. Cool. Does that make sense in terms of preserving the details view? Pretty easy there, right? But that's one of the places where you have to be aware of, you have state variables and such. That's one thing to watch. Anywhere where you're going to have things like this, where you're saying, "Hey, fetch movie" or "fetch reviews" or things like that, where you're assuming it only ever happens once. You have to realize that that's actually happening right now. It's happening every time you do that rotation. So pretty much every activity that you have is probably going to need some sort of twiddle like this. Okay. So for instance, if we talk about the compose review activity, pull up your compose review activity, take a look at what are the things that you need to preserve in the compose review activity.
Errors.
Okay, well, let's make that list.
Speaking of errors, how come we didn't save them in the list or the details page?
I don't need to, because they're all in the view model.
I see.
Because all of my errors are in the view model. I'm not saying any error messages outside of that. I don't have to worry about it. So this is also not saying any error messages. If I was setting error messages in here, then I potentially might need to save some of those things.
Okay.
But because all my error messages are in the view model, I don't have to worry about that.
Okay.
So compose review activity. Okay, so things we need to save are going to be error messages. What else?
Definitely the text.
Okay. The text that the user typed in. What else? What are the data that you have on the composer review activity? Give some other people some chance. So pull that up. Michael? What data do you have in the composer review activity? What's the additional data that you might need? So, the user? Okay. Where do we store the user information? Okay. But the user ID does matter, right? You need to know the user ID that's stored, right? So that has an impact. User ID and maybe the user object. Right. Other things that we need to save? What are you reviewing? Right. So we're reviewing a game, which we got from the intent again. So the game ID, and we might have a game object that we might need to make sure it gets preserved. Right? Those are things I need to restore. Yep.
What about where the cursor is in the text box? Is that going to get lost or not?
That's a good question. And the answer is yes.
It will get lost.
Where the user's cursor is in the text field will be lost. I would say you probably don't want to preserve it though, because the screen size has just changed, and they might actually want to tap into another place. It's actually also worth mentioning, because you rotated, the focus has been lost on that field. So even if it was focused previously, it's not focused anymore, and the keyboard's definitely gone away, more than likely.
Oh, so you do or don't want to keep that state in the whole typing thing? If it was
So I wouldn't want to keep it. I wouldn't want to keep the keyboard up if I turn it sideways.
Okay.
I'd want the user to tap on it again to re-kick off that process. Does that make sense? So that's the thing to ask, but I think generally the answer is no, I don't want to preserve it. Okay. Now, if I had a much larger amount of text that I was entering, like a whole blog article, maybe, but in general, probably not. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. What else? Is there anything else that's in there? What's appearing on screen on Composer View?
Was there supposed to be more? Because mine's kind of blank.
I see something else on your screen.
Oh, it just lost. That's not a good idea.
Yeah, it crashed.
I mean, like,
What's at the top of that screen?
the title?
The
Text view.
The text view, which contains
The movie's name.
the
Or the
movie's
game's
name or the game's name,
Uh-huh.
right? So I also have at the top of the screen, I have the name of the game, which I need to make sure that that gets preserved as well. Okay? I may need to make sure that that gets preserved as well. Okay? So that means something like, okay, when I'm looking at the Compose Review activity, I'm going to need to for sure override on save instance state. Okay? And so in on save instance state, we want to ask what we want to save. So on save instance state, okay? So error messages depend on where they're stored, right? So if you have them stored over in the view model, you're great, no problems. And that should always be the case, okay? If your error message is not stored in the view model, it should be, okay? If you've got an error message that you're not storing in the view model, you want to make that change. And that may mean that you need to add some sort of setter on the view model to say, hey, I want to set the error message. That's okay, right? But if there's an error message that's shown to the user, it should always be in the view model, period. That's an unconditional thing. You never want to be setting those text views directly. Okay? You want to make sure that any code that you have that is setting those text views directly should be moving over to storing it in the view model. That may mean you need additional live data. Okay? So that's the answer with that. Error messages, move it to the view model. Okay? What about the text? Is the text currently stored in the view model? The text that user typed in.
No way.
It's not, right? I think we're just storing that in the edit text. So everybody on board with me there? Okay. So again, in general, I would like things to be stored in the view model. Okay. But there's a little bit of problem with that text. Okay. Can I store it in the view model?
You could probably find a way.
I might be able to find a way, but I actually don't want to. Here's the reason. So on-save instance state needs to be fast. It needs to be really, really blazing fast. Because at the time the date gets called, you're about to be nuked. And if you don't save your data fast enough, you will be nuked before you finish. Okay, and you will lose the data. So whatever you do in there has to be fast. Okay, and that means things like what I've done with this. This is guaranteed to be fast. I'm just taking an integer that's already available and stating it. There's nothing that can be even remotely slow there. But if I try to put something into the V model, there's a whole host of things that could go wrong at that point, because who knows what code and complexity is also in that V model, right? Who knows how long it's going to take to update that live data, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So it's possible that in on-save instance state you could say, hey, let's call the model and let's set the text. Let's save the text there. That might be worth doing, just to throw that out there. It might be worth doing. The problem is just a timing problem, is if that doesn't complete fast enough, then it doesn't work out, right? So rather than saving the text in the view model, I would go ahead and try to save it out to the bundle. Does that make sense? Because it's actively what's on screen, and we didn't try to keep the view model up to date, I would go ahead and just save it out. Okay? Because the activity is owning that data. Does that make sense? So in terms of the text, right, I would expect some sort of put string in here for the text, right? Get it from the text view. Okay. For the user ID, I would definitely expect that we want to save that if it's there, right? Now, the gotcha with the user ID is, remember, I want to push all the backhand logic as much as possible over into the view model. Okay? So in terms of the user ID and the user object, actually, if you've got a field in the activity, you should remove it. You should remove it, and you should have that data only owned by the view model. So the answer here is, I would say, this we need to save to the bundle. This I would say remove the field entirely, because we do have to have a copy of it in the view model anyway. So why were we having two copies? We just should avoid having two copies. Okay? So that's how I would handle that case. Here, I want to save, because this is coming from that intent, I probably want to save the ID to the bundle, but not the object itself. So I might have here saving the game ID. What about the name? Well, the name comes from the database, really should be owned by the vModel, right? So this should really just be, or move to the vModel is maybe the correct here. So if you got it, just move it over to the vModel. Same with here. Oh, I erased the wrong thing. Save ID, and this one would be right. So there's really only a very small amount of data that the activity itself should need to save. Does that make sense? In terms of composer data. The only data that it should need to save is the text that's there and the ID of the game you're looking at. Everything else should be the vModel's job. Does that make sense to everybody? You kind of following my logic with that? Where we can, we want to have the vModel take care of it. And that means not having two copies of it. Yeah.
I noticed in the movie details activity,
Yeah.
you commented out super.onSave instance state, but then in the fragment, movie was fragment, you didn't comment, or you did comment to that.
I just forgot to bring it back in.
Okay, so do we want it in there or do we not?
Yeah, I would bring it back in there. The only reason I commented out,
was just to test it.
yeah, it was just to, test and show that that was what was going on.
Okay.
So all of those, basically I want to do a log first, and then call the superclass, and then save whatever my data is. Cool? So that's kind of the pattern that I want you to follow for all of this.
Okay.
So that's the way that we work around any cases where there are little bits of data that we need to save. It's usually pretty small, right? In the grand scheme of things, usually most things you can move into the vModel and then just not worry about it. But it's those little things that you can't move over to the vModel that are more UI state that you have to preserve. Okay? Questions? Does that make sense to everybody? So, once you implement those things, then all of your screen rotation should work, right? It's just something that you have to do with every screen, with every activity, everything. Okay. So that concludes the first piece of what I wanted to talk about. Again, this is something that's been kind of on my mind to get into and mention real briefly. As you can see, the total amount of code that you have to write is not really that much, but it actually does tie in with a lot of things that we've been doing. And so, it also adds into additional pieces that we've been working with in the vModels, etc. Okay? So that's one thing to keep in mind. There's some little fixes that you'll need to fix, little fixes you might need to make.